We hope you enjoy the following video presentation sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization with a mission to equip and encourage Christians to live their faith within the world of ideas and arts. To help us continue to host events and make videos like this one, please make a donation after viewing the video by going to www.cslewis.org or clicking the link below. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been wonderful being here. I thank Stan and Jean and Steve and all of you who are working on this. It's amazing what you've put together and what you always put together. So I just want to apologize because I'm going to be a teacher this morning. It's the place where I feel the safest. But, and also I've been told that it's shorter than I had planned, so I'm going to skip a lot of slides. But I will promise you that if you just email me, my email's easily found on the web, and it's just mary.poplin@cgu.edu. I will send you this whole PowerPoint with the notes. So the notes have references, so if you're really interested in worldviews, if you really get into this, please know that I'm happy to share it, and then you don't even have to get the book. So, I want to start by saying that this comes out of a horrendous, before I left Mother Teresa's. Everybody says, wasn't she sweet? My entire memory of Mother Teresa is this. So I'm sitting on a bench, and she walks out of the office, and she comes up to me and she says, no, not hello or anything. She just says, God does not call everybody to work with the poor like he called us to work with. And God does not call everybody to live poor like he called us to live. But God does call everybody to a Calcutta. You have to find yours. Okay, now you have to understand that I was a tenured professor when I was told this. I was a tenured professor 5 months before I had this amazing dream that began my conversion to Christ. And the one thing that happened to me after I got back is when I began teaching again the next semester, I had a tremendous intellectual crisis. I would cry. I would start to weep before I would go to class, and I didn't know why I was weeping. I don't know about you, but if you're an intellectual, if you're going to weep, which we don't like to do, if you're going to, you should at least intellectually understand why. Well, I didn't for several months. So anyway, this is a product of that, and I'm just going to literally flip through some slides because I want to tell you a few stories that relate to them. And the first is let's see. I'm going the wrong direction, I take it. Okay, there we go. It's from my favorite sci-fi author, Douglas Adams, who wrote a 4-book trilogy called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he gives us a warning about this to start with. It can be very dangerous to see things from other people's perspectives. And so what I'm going to look at are worldviews. And I think of worldviews now as kind of operating systems of the like an operating system on the computer. It colors the way you look at things. It colors the way we think about things. So the purpose of the talk is really to try to dig into sort of intellectual and spiritual discernment. There's just so much that goes on in the culture, and a lot of times I'm acting in a sort of secular way and not really even aware of it. But Paul warns us in Colossians that he's teaching us so that our hearts could be encouraged to reach the full assurance of the understanding and knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So I want to convince you today that there is in Christ a higher rationality that does not contradict the rationality of secularism, but it does contradict all of its flaws, all of its distortions. And then he says a very important thing. I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. Well, for those of us in the States, we have a lot of plausible arguments in our news every day, and separating all that out is quite a task. So Paul also warns us in Colossians a little bit later, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. So let's think about this. How did Jesus actually tell us about this and warn us about this? Well, one of the passages that stands out a lot is, first of all, he tells us about the tares and the wheat, right? The tares and the wheat are growing. He tells us not to rip them out until the wheat gets full, right? And then to separate the tares from the wheat. He also tells the Pharisees, you can look at the sky and you can predict what the weather's going to be tomorrow, right? But you do not understand the signs of the times. You understand the signs of a sky the day before it happens, but you don't understand the signs of the times. I believe there are really basically 4 global worldviews, and that's all. I know there are wonderful books actually written about 12 worldviews or 9 worldviews or all of this, but I think they can all be grouped into 4 things. The first 2 are secular, and pretty much the Western culture runs on these 2. This is pretty much the dominant part of our culture is either materialism, and we have a great apologetic. We have good apologists for materialism. And the second one that's really almost even impossible to see is called, I'm going to call it secular humanism. That's what most people call it. It is trying to be good and trying to be knowledgeable without God. Stanley Fish says this about secularism. Now, I'm going to quote from a bunch of atheists who know what they're talking about. Stanley Fish is an iconoclastic, wild, postmodern scholar who was dean of the humanities. And he says, for most Americans, secularism is the air we breathe. I would think that's also true here in England and all through Western Europe. It is invisible and sustaining and terribly limiting, all at the same time. It's the most powerful of modern ideologies, and it derives its power from the claim to be above or below or to the side of all ideology. Okay, so that's why it is the air we breathe. It claims to just not even really exist. So then those 2, let's just look at, and then we have pantheism and monotheism of the worldviews that include spirituality, and I'll tell you about those a little bit later. So, but I want to say that let's just look at one example. Let's look at the example of abortion. So what is the explanation, what is the position that each of these worldviews would take? Okay, so first of all, the material naturalist, this is just material. It's a few cells, it's not become a person, it's just an insignificant sort of mass of cells. Secular humanists argue it doesn't matter what it is, it's up to the person in whose body it exists to make a decision about whether this becomes a child or is not born as a child. In pantheism, there is actually an understanding that, that this is a soul that has reincarnated and will have to reincarnate again, okay? And of course, in Christianity and most of the monotheisms, abortion, it is a child. It's a child who has the same God-given gifts of any other person. So what do secularists, and that's what I'll concentrate on today more, believe about themselves? They believe, as Stanley Fish says, that they're neutral, that they're unbiased, and therefore it's true. They're safer and more necessary. It's more reasonable. It's more global. You can take it anywhere. And it's more progressive. Now, I love C.S. Lewis's comment about progressive. He says, if you've taken a wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you nearer. If you're on the wrong road, progress means an about turn, walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive. Okay, I was not very quick at turning around on the road, so I knew a lot about the other road. So what do they believe about religion? What do they believe about those of us who believe? Well, that religion is for the needy. We just somehow individually needed something different, something more. It's a personal choice. It's private. It should stay private. It's dangerous. It's not a candidate for truth, and it's insignificant to a good education. So all of these, so here's an example of how this creeps into the culture and we don't even notice it. So Samuel Huntington, a really excellent Harvard professor, wrote a book a few years ago called The Clash of Civilization. It was after 9/11. And in that book, he says the 20th century conflict between liberal democracy and Marxist-Leninism is only a superficial historical phenomenon compared to what's coming. And that is the deeply conflictual relationship between Islam and Christianity. Now let's stop and think about this. That actually wasn't what 9/11 was about, if anybody read bin Laden's letter. It was against the mass proliferation of the sort of pornographic things that come out of the West. It was against the economic system of the West. They hit the World Trade Towers, the Pentagon, the White House. They tried the White House, and they did not hit the National Cathedral. This is not a fight between two religions. That was not a fight between two religions. I'm not saying that radical Islam loves Christianity. I'm not opposing that. I'm just saying that you see how all of the problems actually are attributed by a secularist to religion, and in particular to Christianity. So here, what is material naturalism? Basically, if you look at any survey of students going into college who are Christian, more of them want to go into the sciences than anything else. And material naturalism is situated in the sciences, but it's not the only thing situated in the sciences. There are many very, very strong Christians in the sciences. But materialism says basically all there really is material. So its faith is that there's just matter, there's energy, and there's the laws and processes that govern them. So there's no God, and eventually to an atheist in science, a person who now we call this scientism, that eventually we'll know everything and we won't have to worry about this God problem. John Lennox, who's here in Oxford, a mathematician, probably if you want to see the best videos of an academic talking in a university setting to a group of students, you should look up any of John Lennox's videos. He looks like Santa Claus without a beard, but his brain is on steroids. So he says, saying that once you know everything, then God doesn't exist is like saying, because I know everything about the internal combustion engine, Henry Ford did not exist. He's always got an answer like that. You just have to look at him. So here's an example of a materialist talking about religion. What they really want to know is what's our brain chemistry? I mean, how do we go so off, right? So trying to discover why we believe is more intriguing than the debate about whether anyone up there is looking down. So here's scientism's limit. I mean, they say a lot of things about origins and all these other things, but the truth is the methodology, science can only deal with material in front of itself, right? That is, its methodology deals with the material and stating facts about that. Now, I do want to say that when I do believe my brain changed and still changes with the more I know about God and the deeper my love comes from that. But I do believe that my mind changed. I believe that my brain chemistry, if you had measured it back in 1992, before my conversion or any of the years close to that, it would have looked very different than it looks now. But it is not my brain chemistry that changed me. It is the relationship with God that changes our brains. But that would be the opposite of the materialists just would not understand that. So what's the most contentious argument in materialism? You can see this. This is a Evolvers Anonymous meeting, and that poor little monkey is standing up saying, "My name is Biff, and lately I've been feeling increasingly self-righteous and violent." So humans are not becoming better and better, he's suggesting. So I just want to say one thing about this, and then I'm going to skip the next slides, but you will have them with you. And that is that the atheist argument about evolution, Michael Roos, who's an atheist, says it was always intended to be against God. But a lot of the Christian scientists, particularly in the US and probably here, are really theistic evolution people. They just believe God created that process. The next three do not believe that, actually. And the biggest fight right now is probably between intelligent design. And you can look that up. I give you lots of references to that. But they basically say there's literally almost no evidence that, okay, so you hear these stories about the moths in London turned black during the Industrial Revolution. The finches on Galapagos beaks get harder when they're in drought because they have to get harder to crack the seeds. There's not one of the 5 on the list I just showed you that doesn't believe that. There are a number of them that don't believe that that means the finch will actually become something different, okay? In other words, they even know that if it starts raining on Galapagos, the finch's beaks will get softer again. They don't become a seagull. So that's the argument, right? Okay, so the argument is this doesn't apply across, this doesn't create new species. But what you'll find, and all of them except the young Earth believe all these things. The universe is 14 billion years old, and the Earth is 4.5. So what is the biggest argument? You will note that even in any sort of show, even PBS shows, they will show you 2 things. They'll compare atheistic evolution to the 6-day creation story, okay? They do that in order to sort of convince people that Christians only believe this one, right? And that this one that has all this data is actually something Christians don't believe because they believe the 6-day story. Now, I'm not going to say all of those stories, including the 6-day story, have data with them. But I'm suggesting to you that this is a mechanism of the secular culture to make Christianity look foolish, because the way they even talk about the 6-day story makes it look foolish. Okay, we're going to split that here. So does it matter what you believe in order to be a scientist? No. Because the practice of everyday science is you've got some material in front of you, and you can have 6 people working together, all on the same suspicious RNA that might be linked to breast cancer, for example, and they could all believe something different about origins and it would not matter. They use exactly the same methodology, whether they believe in 6-day creation or they believe in intelligent design or evolution, as it's generally laid out. Science emerges from Christianity because the early monks believed that the more they could know about the universe, that every time they knew something more about material in the universe, they would understand better the mind of God. That was the purpose. Galileo found, as much as people argue about Galileo, why did Galileo found what he found? Because the church had a telescope, right? Why did the church have telescopes? Well, the church still has a telescope. One of them's in Arizona. So it's the Christian church wanted to know about the universe. It wasn't like they didn't want to know or something. Okay, so what's materialism's limits? Materialism limits is that, number one, they cannot believe in the miraculous, and they will always come up against the miraculous. There is a wonderful book by a woman who's from Harvard and now a professor, I forget where she is now, but her name is Candy Gunther Brown. And she talks about miracles, and as I understand it, I have not met Candy yet, but as I understand it, her husband was healed of blindness in a service that Randy Clark, who was a Dallas Baptist pastor originally, was leading. And Craig Keener is at Asbury, and he has theological seminary, and he has a book. Well, it's not really a book. When I ordered it, I thought, why is this $60? It's actually because it's 2 books that are, it's bound in 2 books, and it is about the history of miracles. It's really amazing if you really want to get into that with millions of references. This is the most serious thing about materialism. There's no moral compass. This is very dangerous because science can find certain things that we can do, but they have no moral compass to say, should it be done? And you can think of all sorts of examples here that are happening right now. Third, it has no answers for life's biggest questions. And fourth, moral problems are redefined as biological. This started when you got people in court and they were freed from their work, they were freed from whatever they did because people suggested that it was not really a decision on their part, it was their brain chemistry, right? And so those are the problems that come in the culture from a materialist belief. So let's look at one of my favorite stories for just a moment. The Samaritan woman. You might know why I would like the Samaritan woman. She and I have a lot in common. So I would also have been so depressed I would have been out after water in the middle of the day. But I want you to read that story again. Because one of the things you realize in that story, if you really study it, is no one in that story gets any water. No one gets any material water. Jesus is exhausted. She's exhausted. They're both thirsty, and they start this conversation. She lays her jug next to the well and leaves it. But at the end of that conversation with Jesus, she is completely refreshed because there is a water, the living water. It's the water that we feel rising up in our belly when we're reading the Bible, and all of a sudden a passage jumps off the page and into our spirit, right? That's the living water. So delude anybody of ever thinking that Jesus ever got a drink of water. And when his disciples come and even offer him food, he says he's refreshed because he's doing what the Father has called him to do, right? Okay, so materialists always come against God. Each one of these worldviews actually come against a different person of the Trinity. But these, you'll see them always writing things like the God delusion, which comes out of here, actually, Oxford. Okay, so I'm just going to suggest to you that in Christianity there is this higher rationality, and that's just a quick picture of it. C.S. Lewis says it like this. Man is like a tower from which all of the floors, the top floor, all of the floors cannot be reached from the bottom. But every floor can be reached from the top. Okay? So that's the option. That is the gift that we have, is the ability to have a higher rationality and to look down on things as they really are. Secular humanism, the most dominant one, the one that particularly masquerades as no worldview. Here's some words that you probably went through in college that are part of secular humanism. But the single best thing to remember about secular humanism is this. When Jean-Paul Sartre died, this is not a picture of that, but when Jean-Paul Sartre died, Paul Conrad, who was the cartoonist for the Los Angeles Times, did a cartoon. And he did picture Sartre carving himself, and he had gotten around to about his ankles, and the bottom said, "Man makes himself." And then it had Sartre's dates on it. That is the image for secular humanism. Man makes himself. And I want to read one quote to you. Just close your eyes and imagine this. This is from Sartre, but this is the best quote, single quote of secular humanism. If man, as the existentialist conceives him, is indefinable, it is because at first he is nothing. Only afterward will he be something, and he will have made what he will be. Thus, there's no human nature, since there's no God to conceive it. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. At start, man is a plan which becomes aware of itself, and nothing exists prior to this plan. There is nothing in heaven. Man will be what he will have planned to be. And here's the more frightening sentence. When we say a man is responsible for himself, we do not only mean he's responsible for his own individualism, but that he is responsible for all men. We have a lot of people running around the world who believe this. And one of the most frightening things I've read recently is that if you look at almost all the Western leaders, especially in Western Europe and here even, very few of them have any children. They're making themselves. And they're making you and I too. Okay, so radical individual freedom is really the characteristic here. And this is the most dangerous piece. You will not hear in the social sciences and the humanities the word truth spoken of in a serious way anymore. Because truth does no longer exist. It is simply the construction of human meanings, okay? So human beings construct meanings based on their race, their history, their gender, their experiences, and their desires. Okay? There's no such thing as truth, something true. It's just that we're making up meanings, the construction of meanings. So how does a secularist pull together common meanings? Well, they do it through human dialogue. The question is, who gets invited to King Arthur's table to create this dialogue? And we all know it's not likely to be us, right? So even though Habermas, who's top German continental philosopher, actually, we don't know about what Ratzinger did. Pope Benedict actually pulled philosophers together in Europe and convinced a lot of atheist philosophers not to become Christian, but to take it seriously. And Habermas actually has come out with a statement that says everything we love about the West comes straight out of Judeo-Christian framework, and everything else since then has been nothing but postmodern chatter. Now that's pretty serious coming from a top philosopher who is not a believer. So here's the conundrums. We're going to keep moving because I know they're watching me over here. Tolerance. So John Rawls said, here's how we solve this, American philosopher. We just have to have radical tolerance. We have to accept the fact of overlapping ideas. But Stephen Smith, a Catholic at University of San Diego who writes in the area of political science, says, an expansion of one person's freedom means a contradiction of another person's freedom. If we recognize and protect the freedom of the pornographer to market pornographic materials, we reduce the freedom of people to live and raise their children in a pornographic-free community. So he was kind of doing all this. This is a list of the philosophers that were highly influenced by the European philosophers who were highly influenced by Pope Benedict. Habermas and Pera both wrote a book with Benedict after he had pulled all these people together. He pulled them together before he was Pope. And Marcello Pera is an Italian philosopher who became a part of the Italian Senate. He was for 9 years, I believe, the president of the Italian Senate. And his new book, believe it or not, he also says he's an atheist, but his book is called Why We Should Call Ourselves Christian. Okay, so I thought this has to be some English you know, somebody in America changed the title. So I got a friend who speaks Italian to look up Italian Amazon. And he said, sure enough, in Italian, it also says why we should call ourselves Christian. And basically, he says because it gives us a possibility of analyzing our culture in terms of it is possible to know that this is better than that. Right? And that Europe, I would say this is also true in America, that Europe has lost the ability to say this is better than that. Right? And you can just see that it has emanated through the country, through both countries. And there's the quote I was reading. If I can remember. Okay, so he's saying that we've lost the ability to say, Marcelo Pera is saying, we lost the ability to say that this is actually better than that. This culture is better than that. So Habermas and Pera are both saying, look, when we both of them are atheists, when we believed in Judeo-Christian thought, we were better. And now we have no way to say this is better than that. We've lost even the ability to make those kinds of judgments. And there'll be lots of quotes. Here is the Marcelo Pera quote. Two religious systems can be compared by their consequences. And here too, one may be judged as better than the other. By better, we mean it recognizes and respects more fundamental rights, satisfies more expectations, allows for more efficient and transparent democratic institution, and so on. Pierre Manet is a Catholic philosopher in France, and he has also written about this. And he says that the Western countries in America have lost the ability to know who they are. So when they receive immigrants, they have no way of saying to them, look, this is who we are. You're welcome to come, but you cannot do this, this, and this. Right? So you lose the foundation of your country, so you can't actually make a judgment. You can't actually say, you're welcome to come, but this is not okay. All right? So secular humanism, basically, human beings can be good on their own. Sin is the thing we hate, most people hate the most about Christianity. But the truth is that sin, if you look at it in the Bible, it's like, there's always these lines where God says, don't do this, so it'll go well for you, right? Sin is just simply missing the mark of human flourishing. That is, you are doing something that's going to inhibit you or your nation from flourishing. So here's a few quotes that I'm not going to read to you. And this is important because, you know, Christians can't say, like, we're always better than you. And Lewis has that wonderful story of the man and the woman in one of his, and I think it's in Mere Christianity. And he says the only thing you can say is a person who becomes a Christian will be better than he or she would have been before. And then he warns us that good and evil increase at compound interest. And this is really true. The little tiny decision that we make every day takes us one direction or the other direction, right? And that is one of my favorite quotes. An apparent trivial indulgence in lust or anger today is the loss of a ridge or a railway line or a bridgehead from which the enemy may launch an attack otherwise impossible. And this is Ann Hendershot just saying, what we've done is not only attach, we've given sort of, we've redefined evil, basically. The redefinition begins with a linguistic assault, and this has happened in all the cultures. We started with nice sitcoms, and then we started redefining things. The redefinition begins with a linguistic assault. Words like crazy and deeply disturbed were once connected to suicide. Today, they've been replaced with words like dignity and autonomy, while those who oppose it are stigmatized as zealots. Okay, we can see that in our lifetime, this has really turned around. So what are the problems of secular worldviews? The same thing. There's no moral plumb line. There's no permanent ethical boundaries. And there's a belief that human reasoning is sufficient. Well, human reasoning's become postmodern and now post-postmodern. And the basic issue is everyone in the world has to decide who Christ is. So here's the summary of the things that secular humanism does to the culture. It exalts the second commandment without the first, and it shifts the meaning of truth, and education, media, and politics begin to change culture through language and images. So secular humanism always comes against Jesus, because he was partly human, right? He was fully human and fully God. So this is my favorite other. Now, you have to ask yourself, why does every single superhero movie reinvent Jesus' story? No matter where you are in the world. You see, the idea of Jesus is actually in the consciousness of human beings everywhere. And so you just have one superhero after another. If you have not seen the 1980s film Buckaroo Banzai, you must, I'm sorry, you're just not educated. This is the only superhero movie for intellectuals. And you must see it because Buckaroo Banzai is both the top brain surgeon, he is the top astrophysicist in the world. He creates a way of driving he drives a pickup through a Texas mountain, which is in El Paso. There's only one mountain in Texas. So it sort of displaces material, right? And he's the leader of the top rock band. Okay, all of those things in one. Now that is, you must put that on your list, Buckaroo Banzai. Okay, so this one comes against Jesus, obviously. So now we're going to go to pantheism as quick as possible. How many more minutes do I have? About 10? Whoa, I'm doing it. We may make it. Okay, pantheism. In the United States, and probably here too, pantheism looks more like I'm spiritual and not religious. And I used to tell people that all the time, especially Christians. And what was I saying to you? I was saying, I can be good without God. I can be spiritual. I can be Shirley MacLaine on the beach dancing. I can be all these things that, all these people that Oprah Winfrey interviews. Those of you in England, I'm sorry you don't get to see that, but okay, I'm going to give you an example. I was really led to Christ by a Native American. He's very, very strong, and I thought he would send me to a sweat lodge, but he sent me to a monastery and an evangelical teacher. So, anyway, but before, okay, so right when I came to Christ, I was, we used to meet, because he knew who I was, at a New Age restaurant in San Diego. Okay, he's in San Diego, I'm in Los Angeles. And so we would meet at this restaurant, and one day we're there, and I guess he thought I would feel very comfortable. And so there's this woman there who's kind of like the New Age guru of San Diego. And she's kind of holding court, and she pays and leaves, or she leaves, I think they pay for her, but she leaves right before we do. And when we walk out, this guy had a little Toyota, I forget, it was one of those little Toyota cars. I don't think they make that version anymore. Anyway, had a little car parked in the middle of his parking place, and she has a big old, like, Cadillac or something. And she pulls out and she hits his car. Okay, so he goes and he stands by his car. He just stands there. She jumps out of her car and starts screaming at him, right? She's just screaming at him. Now, I don't know how many of you have known Native Americans. This is the most peaceful guy I've ever seen. So he stands there and there's no expression on his face, none whatsoever. There's not a facial muscle moving. And she jumps out of the car, she starts screaming at him, ranting and raving, and she makes the mistake of taking a breath. At which time he says to her very calmly, "This is who you really are." He says things like that to me too. Okay, so that makes her not more happy. So now she gets a little louder, right? I mean, she has hit his car and nothing else has changed. So she's screaming at him again. And then she takes a breath again. And he says exactly the same thing, exactly the same way. This is who you really are. Okay, well, then she starts screaming a little bit more, and then she runs in the car when she takes the next breath. But I think he actually said it 2 or 3 times. That is who I was also when I thought I was Shirley MacLaine, right? I didn't think I was Shirley MacLaine, but I thought I could be like her, right? So that is a really good understanding of spiritual and not religious. It's the idea that I can be good without God, and there's all these other things you get into. I say that my religion was the Whole Foods. Sorry if you don't have Whole Foods in England, but if you have sort of New Agey grocery stores and things like that, you'll find they all have a bulletin board about all the things you can get involved in, like the Course in Miracles or the, whatever it is, so whatever the thing of the day is. But there is a serious pantheism. And the biggest division between pantheism and Christianity is, what do you do with desire? Now, I realize that Stephen Jobs said he was a Buddhist. However, the biggest thing in Buddhism is to get rid of desire. Don't think he got very far on that one. But here's the story that's actually behind all that. The belief that desire always blocks enlightenment, that it always leads to suffering, and in order to avoid suffering, you follow the 4 noble truths. That you understand that misery comes from desires, and they can be eliminated if you follow a particular path. So a lot of prayers and meditation exercises in Buddhism actually are to get rid of desires. It's the opposite in Christianity in a way. It's not that Christianity does not recognize the problem of desires, but it's very specific. We have right desires and we have wrong desires, right? And in order to, and the right desires actually form our life purpose. That is, the desire in our heart, the deepest desire in our heart is actually whatever, that forms who we are, who we're called to be. And suffering in Christianity, this is probably not its most famous line, but suffering builds character. If we suffer rightly, we always grow. If we suffer wrongly, we always go backwards. And God gives desires to human beings, and there is this redemption. You see, Christianity is all about redemption. It's the thing that separates it really from almost everything else. It's not that we're better than anyone. So I also work with girls in the jail sometimes. And I have a friend who also does, and she calls this the bar of soap scripture. And it's 1 John 1:9. And it says, if I am faithful to confess my sins, he is faithful to forgive me. But that's not the end of it. He's faithful to forgive me and to cleanse me from all unrighteousness. That is so important, and it's often left out. So when I was in the University of Texas, we used to watch pornographic movies. They were called Friday night modern movies or something, I don't know. So that gets things started, and then so throughout my life I would watch with partners, and then when I came to Christ I knew immediately. I knew before, but I made it conscious that this was wrong. It was bad for me. So I never wanted to watch another one again after I repented. It's like people who do drugs and they say, I gave my life to Christ and I never had another drink or something. But the consequences are still there. So I could be driving down the Los Angeles freeway where you have a lot of time, and an image would come into my mind from one of those movies. And as soon as I realized it, I would say, if I were alone in the car, I would say out loud, God, you saw that, I confess to you it's a sin. I ask you not only to forgive me, but I ask you to cleanse me from it. And sure enough, in a couple years, I never saw any of those scenes again. They never popped into my mind. And then we don't have time, but actually later the Lord put me next to a guy who made pornographic films on the airplane. And I believe that guy was saved, I tell you. But so here's a definition of karma. This is something that's not a part of Christianity. You do not keep your karma. Everything you do wrong is not just stacked up against you. It's redeemed. It's redeemed. It's forgotten. God says, I don't even remember it, right? Why should you? And that is the problem of secular psychology, which is almost the exact opposite of Christianity. Number one, you do not forgive yourself. There's no such thing in the Bible of forgiving yourself. Can you imagine if we were made so we could forgive ourselves? We'd just do what we wanted and then forgive ourselves. You don't forgive yourself. God forgives us, and it's over. It's done. And these girls in the jail, they just keep going over and over and over everything they've done in their life. That is not a Christian principle. And it shouldn't be in Christian psychologists' minds either. So, karma versus sin and redemption. Can you be a Christian and a Buddhist? No, Dalai Lama tells you that. Once you have a certain degree of realization, the choice between the two paths is actually necessary. So here's the problem for those of us Presbyterians. Well, actually, this is a problem in the West. We have a very hard time wrapping our head around the fact of spiritual transactions. We understand things in the material world, we understand humanism and those kinds of things, but really understanding that when people come, like they did since 9/11, groups of Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhists have been building these mandalas of colored sand in museums and then throwing them in the body of water. They're calling forth the, actually these little things that they're drawing around are actually demons. They even call them demons. And they're drawing forth the spirit of peace. I'm telling you, the spirit of peace in Buddhism is not peace in Christianity. And they are spirits. There is such a thing. I had to be delivered. God sovereignly delivered me of the things I had gotten myself into. And there are tons of students in the university doing those kinds of things. There are even black masses. I mean, there are really dangerous things going on, and we are pretty naive, including most Christians are pretty naive about the spiritual world and the way it operates. But it's all through the Bible. Just think of 2 Kings. The Moabites and the Israelites are fighting. God's called the Israelites to fight the Moabites, and they're winning, winning, winning. And then suddenly, the king pulls 70 swordsmen on the front. This is 2 Kings 2 in this battle. And the swordsmen, they don't make it through either. And then the king of Moab takes his firstborn son and sacrifices him on the wall, and Israel cannot break through. These things are real. It wouldn't be in the Bible if it wasn't real. Almost everything in the Bible actually is a spiritual transaction or a discussion of the spiritual transaction that happens when we do particular things. So Charles Kraft's been at Fuller. I believe he's retired now, but he has this tiny, tiny book on spiritual laws, and basically these are the major principles. There are dispensers of spiritual power. There's a close relationship, and they have a close relationship between spiritual and human realms. That's why Paul says, you're not fighting people, you're fighting powers and principalities of the air, right? There's a major difference between God and less powerful spirits. Authority and power flow from allegiances, relationships, and obedience. Cultural forms can be spiritually empowered, and territories and organizations are subject to spiritual power. There's a man who's a very top businessman in the country, and I don't know how he found out about me or why he called me, but he called me and he said, would you meet with my son and myself? Okay. So his son, who was a strong Christian, went to Biola and then transferred to a secular university, and he allowed that. And he got very tight with a professor who called himself a Buddhist, but I think he was more of a sort of American Buddhist, which is a mix of stuff. And this guy got into stuff, and so we had a number of conversations, and then he moves up north to Portlandia, and and he gets involved in more and more stuff, right? And eventually he ends up in a psychiatric ward. Okay, these things happen, and we've got to be very careful. We've got to learn a lot more than we know. And that's why the charismatic church grew so much. That's why it's still growing all over the world. The charismatic evangelicals outnumber regular evangelicals 2 to 1, even in the United States. So we have to really begin to get smart about it. I'm not saying every charismatic church is smart about it. I'm just saying they do accept it. Okay, so the part of the Trinity that pantheists come against is always the Holy Spirit versus spirits. Okay? So the summary. I can't believe I made it to the end. Aren't you proud? Oh, I see the red flag. Maybe I didn't. Okay, well, here's just some principles. All of these worldviews begin with a faith, whether they admit it or not. Even the materialists, they begin with a metaphysical statement. There's some overlap with Christianity in every single one. There's some principles that lie outside Christianity, and Judeo-Christian principles rise above that. So we have the possibility of a higher worldview, higher understanding. So here's Leslie Newbigin, a British apologist to India, who came back after years and years of developing apology for the Hindus, and came back to England and couldn't believe that when he left it was Christian, and when he came back it wasn't. And here he's talking about the same thing. The Christian claim is that though the Christian worldview can be not reached by any logical step from the axioms of other worldviews, nevertheless, the Christian worldview offers a wider rationality that embraces and does not contradict the rationality of all other worldviews. Okay, we made it. And you get